Hello, I'm Marcus Stiglegger. I'm professor of film studies in Berlin, and currently I'm writing a book with Eugenio Ercolani about the film Cruising by William Friedkin, made in 1980 and featuring Al Pacino. It's a very landmark film today, but when it came out, it was really troubled and was considered kind of a failure and a scandal as well. The film now turns 40 in the year 2020, and it's still there. It's still a cult film. So I would like to give you some remarks on the troubled history of the making of Cruising, what it is based on, and how it turned out. The film is based on a novel around 1970 called Cruising by Gerald Walker. He was a journalist in New York, and he writes on the gay scene and some killings taking place in the gay scene, and an undercover cop called John Lynch, who is placed as a bait for the killer because his looks resemble the looks of the victims. So this novel is covering the gay scene around the late 60s and around 1970. It has no relation to the S&M scene, which appeared later in New York City and which is the background of the film, obviously. So there is a huge difference between both. Also, the novel is criticized for being really homophobic in its subtext. When I read the novel, I had the impression it is what William Friedkin says about his film, actually. It's more of a crime mystery thriller focusing on a bizarre background in a way and some unusual aspects at the time. But the motivation of the killer is definitely homophobic, but with a strong homosexual subtext of his own homosexuality, which he seems to want to erase. So there is this very clear-cut novel, and the film is much more twisted, as we will see. There is another tendency which is very important to know before dealing with the film. It is the art of Tom of Finland. Tom of Finland created a gay pornography and a gay art at the same time, focusing on the leather people, on the men clad in full leather uniforms, what is known today as the bluff or the bluff, the black leather uniform fetish union. So this is something which was very much coined by the drawings of Tom of Finland. And I think there are strong influences seen in the film Cruising and other films around 1980, actually, as I will mention later. The protagonists of the making of Cruising as an adaptation of Gerald Walker's novel are quite changing over the years, and it begins with Philip D'Antoni. He's the producer of French Connection, the film which was the first Academy Award-winning success by William Friedkin. And Philip D'Antoni, he was into producing cop films, obviously, at the time, very popular things, because Dirty Harry was popular and French Connection. So it seems to be a good idea to adopt this novel as well. And he didn't ask William Friedkin in the beginning, although it was proposed to William Friedkin at that time, and he refused it because he didn't like the novel. But the director who first dealt with it and who first made kind of a draft of the screenplay was Steven Spielberg. It's hard to imagine that today, and he rarely talks about this, but he was very much involved with developing this project, and it was at that time still connected with the standard gay scene of Manhattan. Then a second producer acquired the rights after they went out for Philip D'Antoni, and the second producer was Jerry Weintraub. Jerry Weintraub was searching for another edgy director, and he found it in Brian De Palma. Brian De Palma was a very hot director around the mid-70s for making Sisters, for making Carrie, and he was interested in the undercover police work. And you see strong influences in the film Blowout by Brian De Palma with the undercover work of in some of the flashbacks of the film. And also you have to know that the film Prince of the City, another cop film on corruption within the police system, was prepared by Brian De Palma, but later filmed by Sidney Lumet. So at that time, Brian De Palma was developing the film, and there is a interesting key scene in his version that shows the killer murdering a woman to get the police on the wrong track. So this scene was the key element that later went into his film Dressed to Kill. Mentioning Dressed to Kill and Sisters before, it is very interesting to see that at that time, during the 70s, there was a huge influence of European films on the American genre film market, and especially the Italian erotic thrillers called giallo. These films made by Sergio Martino, Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, and so on, these films were seen by directors like John Carpenter, who later made Halloween, and Brian De Palma. And this is a basis that brings me to the idea that the films made by the American directors later, films like Dressed to Kill, but also a film like Cruising, can be considered kind of a global giallo tendency. So they are referring strongly to the Italian style of erotic thrillers, and at the same time transport this into another dimension, into another country and another atmosphere, and combine it with their own elements. So this is my phrase of the global giallo phenomenon, just to place this here. William Friedkin was actually the third director after Spielberg and De Palma who dealt with the film Cruising. And his first idea was to cast it with Richard Gere in the main role, because he found Richard Gere in kind of an ambivalent male character with a very strong erotic attitude, and so it might be interesting to imagine this film starring Richard Gere. But when Pacino expressed a strong interest, the producer was really after Friedkin and convinced him to star Al Pacino in his film. Because Al Pacino at that time, he had a huge success with The Godfather, obviously, but also with Serpico. Serpico is also an undercover cop film, and it has some similarities, so that might be an interesting connection as well. When Cruising was shot already, there were huge protests from the gay community, because at that time the gay community was gaining confidence, and they were coming out of the closet, as it was called back then, and they called to boycott the making of Cruising, because they said it's an homophobic film and it's like a backlash, and how Hollywood sees homosexuality as a threat and a world of violence. And there were like buttons circling saying that stop the movie Cruising and so on. So what Friedkin did is he cast his film with a lot of extras from the actual leather scene, and he shot in the actual leather clubs.
How big are you?
Party size.
What are you into?
I go anywhere.
And as much as he was boycotted and protested, the film was supported by a huge potential of clients from the actual S&M gay leather background. And Al Pacino, he had no experience with this scene, and he got into the atmosphere of the clubs as a newbie, and therefore he was acting out what his character actually experiences in the same scenes. And you can clearly see it in the scenes when he experiences like water sports and fisting, because this was a huge fisting based scene back then. Also, it has to be said that this scene was pretty unsafe at that time, because the HIV was not known back then, and a lot of those people got infected and later actually died of this virus. And in the same scene in San Francisco, for example, there was the philosopher Michel Foucault, and he had probably their situation of infection, which made him die in 1988. So it was a scene which is kind of died out over the next decade, and very rarely you can meet veterans from that scene, actually. So the scene back then was connected to the Fist-Fucking Association of America, and in the film, especially in the new versions of the film, because William Friedkin has made two reversions, you can see number plates, license plates of cars featuring FFA. So that was, a connection to this underground cult as well. Also, the film was shot during live and real club action, and as William Friedkin says, it has had a lot of pornographic, hardcore pornography, which was later censored when the film was presented to the MPAA. It was a huge scandal already there because of the explicit footage, and Friedkin agreed to cut a lot of these things. And what stayed in the film are subliminal hardcore inserts of anal sex during the murder scenes, which is quite controversial, in my opinion, because it might feed the idea of the film being homophobic and connecting homosexuality with violence and death. Like Leo Bersani said in his book, Is the Rectum a Grave? There is a strong connection made between a kind of death drive and active homosexuals. The film also was known for his soundtrack. The soundtrack featured among the title song by Willy DeVille, which later was used in Death Proof by Quentin Tarantino as well. A lot of punk songs of the time. The Germs is, for example, one of those well-known punk bands which are featured on the film soundtrack, and this soundtrack does not reflect the actual music which was played in the clubs, because there was a lot of pumping disco sound heard in the real clubs, and it is replaced by this more destructive and aggressive music which Friedkin chose for his film, and which changed the atmosphere a lot. Also, the clubs which are shown in the film are documented in a way. Scene is documented in a way that it is now not present anymore. There is most of these clubs are closed down. They are replaced by other establishments and so on. Also, there is the legendary hanky code is explained by Powers Booth in one scene, which refers to certain practices, sexual preferences, signaled by the colors of the hankies. And all these things stayed within the scene, and Cruising documents a certain moment in time when this was in full bloom, and the film can now be seen as this vivid, living document of this time, which might be gone in this form by today. If you visit New York today, I did this, you will not see these things anymore. And it is much more in the underground now. You might experience such an atmosphere of people clad in leather walking the streets in Berlin, rather in Berlin, or probably in the Trochergarten Club in London, compared to the time back then in Manhattan. And so this film is referred to at a later time by other filmmakers, and in Irreversible by Gaspar Noé, for example, we have references to this, and even Gaspar Noé has a cameo in one of the leather clubs, in the leather club in the beginning, the Rectum. And there is a film, Inside Leather Bar, which tried to, by James Franco, which tries to reconstruct what was lost during the censorship of cruising. But this film is far from what was actually lost, because as Friedkin points out, this was actual pornography, while the film Interior Leather Bar is more of a kind of a meta film on shooting male desire and discussing it with the actors and so on. And the film has not much to do with the actual film by Friedkin. So what is a good thing is that the heritage of the film is unquestioned, and it just came out as another restored version, helmed by William Friedkin by Arrow Entertainment. And Arrow had a hard time dealing with Friedkin, because he wanted control over his film mainly, and so he was questioning a lot of the supplemental materials. He was again manipulating the color color scale of the film, and there is this first DVD version which is really blue, while the original film, which I know from a VHS cassette from the 1980s, is very realistic in his color scheme. So the new version is again different. It is a little bit back towards the original, but also it has some new elements, some digital manipulations. The DVD has a lot of them. The Blu-ray has very few left of this, but it's still there. So it's interesting how this film stayed and prove his importance over time, and how it is still followed by a lot of people, a lot of heterosexual people as well, because it is a film that captures a certain freedom of sexual expression in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which might be lost today, or is changed forever. So this film is still fascinating, and if you haven't seen it, you should go see it. Bye.